All right, how's it going, guys? My name is Caleb Kioh, founder of WalletGyde, and we are here again with Marshall Moore, and we're going to be talking about money conversations. Isn't that right, Marshall? Are we going to be talking about money?
Oh, I'm excited. You know it, Caleb.
Oh, man, I know. So was it like a couple of weeks ago? I know this was the initial plan, but sometimes the universe or whatever comes in the way and we have to kind of pivot a little bit. But hey, now we have an opportunity to come back even stronger and better, don't we?
Exactly.
Nice. So, I mean, guys, one of the key things that I always like to talk about when I run into Marshall is just how much of a financial, I don't know if you want to call it nerd is not the right, I like to say enthusiast. We are just super excited about money, talking about money. I know I had my own personal reasons why I'm like super like passionate and enthusiastic about money. And I'm sure Marshall also has his reasons as well, right, Marshall?
100%.
Well, I think we're here to talk about that. And by the way, before we even dive into it, it's important to understand, guys, that this is not just a regular guy that I have sitting across from me here. This is Marshall Moore, he might as well be the face of Untapped Credit Union at this point. So he is out there in the community doing financial workshops, doing podcasts, doing all speaking engagements. So he's, pretty much sought after in Denver. At this point, this is not just a run-in-the-mill dude here. So it's always good to give some context of the people that, especially out here in WalletGyde, with our WalletGyde podcast, it's very important because we at WalletGyde, we've always been really big on getting the best and the brightest of the minds, financial minds, to talk about a very important conversation such as money. So, Marshall, let's start from like maybe, I don't know, when you were young, all that stuff, but no, let's really start from your background.
Yeah.
Let's talk about what made you get into money.
It's a good question, and it is like a whole story.
I bet.
Yeah. So I grew up as like a very unmoney motivated kid. I was always a saver, and my brother was the opposite. But if we take a step back from me, sure, before I tell you more of my story, like, we all come to money from a different perspective, right? 100%. And it's not just, did I grow up without it, or did I grow up with an overabundance of it? Of course, you're going to see money from a different lens, sure, if you grew up in one of those circumstances, but you could have grown up anywhere along the spectrum of income, and you could still see money as being the root of all evil, right? Like the thing that makes big corporations do unethical things. Sure. Or maybe you grew up in an entrepreneurial family. Mm-hmm. Again, anywhere across the spectrum of income, and you could see money as being the value exchange that I get when I do good in the world, yes, right? And so, like, are you gonna act differently or feel differently about your money if you believe one of those things, or any of the million of different stories that we could tell ourselves in between that or outside of that? Like, right, probably, right? Because, like, the great psychologist Carl Jung said something to the effect of, and I'm not going to get his quote exactly right, but fine, something to the effect of, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you'll call it fate. That's right. And so like those are the things that we have, these money stories that we grow up with, and they come from somewhere. And if we don't start identifying what some of those are, then we may not even recognize some of the patterns through which we are not being intentional with this tool that ultimately is the tool that we can use to design the lives we want to live. Right. And so I think it's a super important topic. For me, I think part of the reason that I grew up as a not very money motivated kid was because I grew up a little bit more on that side of like, money is the root of all evil. And, of course that comes from my background, and like, I won't go into all the details, but essentially, like, my dad worked a lot when I was growing up. Like he wasn't really around for, I don't know, many of the things that I thought a normal, growing kid would have their dad around for.
Sure.
And the reason for that was like, as a young kid, I didn't see this, I didn't know it, but the reason for it was extremely valid. And it was that his whole goal was to be able to provide for his family, right? And that's a very common, especially in our society, it's a common gender stereotype for men to feel that way, that men are, we feel that we're the providers and things like that. But for him, it also came from the fact that his dad, grew up in times when there wasn't much money. His dad grew up very poor. They went through the Depression, and there's this famous story about my dad as an adult. When I was probably in high school, he was really big. He played football in school, and so his neck was huge, and normal ties, they wouldn't fit quite right. And he was telling his dad about how he doesn't have to go and buy a custom tie for work because he can just take it to the dry cleaners, and for $2 they'll adjust it for him so that it fit his neck. And his dad goes, $2? You would pay $2 for the, he's like, do it yourself. Don't spend $2 on that, right?
Yes.
And so like my dad wanted his family to not feel the same crunch for money that he felt growing up.
Absolutely.
And then, it sent me in the opposite direction almost, right? And so I was a science kid. I ended up going to school. I got my degree in the sciences. I ended up becoming a high school teacher. I got very into trying to create curriculum that was a little bit more real world. But I was off on my own, like not thinking about money, right? I got my first teaching job out of school, and as a young person, even though teachers didn't make a lot of money, like I was told, hey, at least take the match on a 401k if you have access to it, which I had a 401k for reasons that I won't go into.
Sure.
Teachers sometimes have like pension-esque type plans. That's a whole nother topic that I love to talk about. We might get to it later.
Sure.
But, my advice was like, hey, at least take the 401k match. And then beyond that, like, I didn't get, it was kind of just like, hey, like I cover my living expenses. Like I don't have a, wife and kids and family or anything, but there were so many things that I could have done early on, right? And so it wasn't until a couple of years later, got really into teaching, science in a way that had real world connections. And I switched to teaching math. And that was where my first year that I was teaching second semester seniors. And I'm like doing all these cool curriculum, statistics and relating it to the real world.
Nice.
And we get to second semester, and you know how it goes. High school seniors, man. Like, they're like, they have senioritis. And they're like, when are we ever going to use this stuff? And I'm like, man, I'm not going to lie to you all. You're not going to use a lot of what we're talking about right now. And I decided to take the curriculum and replace it with a financial literacy curriculum instead.
Really?
And that's where, man, talk about the amount of math that you can fit into a financial literacy curriculum, right? But that was my big learning as a high school teacher was I loved the numbers, right? I just wanted to show people this beautiful compounding interest spreadsheet. Doesn't that make you want to take ownership of your finances? And it's like, no, we're human beings. Like, that's not what motivates us, right? And so that's what sent me down the pathway of really learning about and creating curriculum surrounding money psychology. And it's also what eventually made me get into the role that I'm in now, which is, essentially what I do now is I run a foundational financial education and coaching program at no cost to our community. That includes presentations. It includes going and linking up with local companies and helping them develop a financial wellness program for their employees. Because we know that if employees are stressed about their personal finances, they're less productive and the company retains them for less amount of time. So I help the companies in that way, but it also helps their employees. And then I do free one-on-one coaching sessions with their employees as well. And then I do that same thing, no cost coaching sessions with people in our community. And so all of that kind of developed from that financial literacy curriculum that I was running, where I began to have a realization that, like, man, people need this, right? Like, other teachers started coming to me and saying, like, hey, can we do an after school session? Because I got to get my finances in order. Because, dude, here's the thing. We live in a capitalist society that just throws us to the wolves, financially speaking, right? Like, we don't get any of that training. We don't come out of school with a common language of a housing expense ratio or 6 months of long-term reserves, or right? And so we end up, most people end up learning about personal finances and money management through making mistakes and correcting them over time. And it's 2025 and the margin for error for making mistakes is thinner than it's ever been, right?
Oh my
So
God.
we need to have these conversations. We need to cease
my
to have
God.
money be taboo in our society. So that's my background.
Oh.
I'll give you from there and let you
Woo!
take it.
I told you guys, right? I told you guys the passion, the enthusiasm, right? I mean, you can't make this up. This is what it's all about, right? I mean, we need more passionate people in the space of personal finance, in the space of just finance in general, right? And I love your story. I would even read the statistics here that says, it's according to New York Post, that over 50% of Americans feel financially frozen, right? So let that sink in. 50%, they feel overwhelmed or unsure about their financial decisions and things, on and on and on and on, to your point, because they don't have the foundation. They're not taught. So to kind of just keep going into where you left off. Who were your go-to? Because this is really important to. I would like to kind of see how you mapped out, because there's always that beginning of like, okay, once you realize, whoa, this is a problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then the next step is like, what sort of foundation should I build, right? So I'm interested to know who were your go-to gurus and go-to people that helped you solidify. Before I have you chime in, I want to kind of throw a little bit of mine too. So I'll start off and just say, because I was really excited about Robert Kiyosaki, guys like that, and just those sort of names. I know there's Morgan Housel with The Psychology of Money, right? And then Ramit Sethi. There's all these. I mean, the list goes on with so many different financial gurus out there. And then of course on top of that, I actually went to school for business finance. So I actually, we'll talk about this. It's not about me, it's about you. But we'll talk about this a little down the line, of how by understanding accounting is what helped me actually start building WalletGyde. Because I actually started understanding how money flows through financial statements. So in addition to that, and the financial gurus. So I'm interested, because that was how my foundation was built. Interested to know how you went about building your knowledge base of personal finance.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. Okay. So I want to come back to this idea of cash flow, because it's a really important one, and there are some ways to translate it from the broader accounting sense into the personal finance sense. And also there's a lot of good lessons out there for aspiring entrepreneurs and small business owners in terms of when do you need to understand your accounting from a 360-degree view instead of just know the P&L and things like that, right? But in terms of the influences, I think the thing for me was that I obviously can get into the numbers as a math teacher and nerd out on them, right? But again, I grew up as a not very money motivated kid. And so like when I started actually creating my own personal systems for finance, I realized that I didn't want to spend all my time in the details and tracking every expense. I wanted to create simple systems that were not optimizing for making the most money over, the entire span of my lifetime, but instead optimizing for spending the minimum amount of time necessary while achieving the results that I wanted in terms of lifestyle.
Love it.
And so like, how do you create systems like that? And this is where I think there's a couple of gurus that I want to come back to. But before I say that, I think that this idea of cash flow becomes really important and valuable when we're thinking about how to create simple systems. And the reason for that is because cash flow feels like a really simple equation on the surface level, right? Like we have income coming in and we have expenses plus savings, and that's really it. But if you think about the dynamics that are happening there, it's not as simple as it seems, right? And so many of us manage it by feel, but what's really happening is with income, most people's income is variable. Entrepreneurs, certainly, but even for salaried folks, overtime, bonuses, whatever, right? And almost everybody's expenses are variable. And so if you think about the math behind that, it's like having a bucket with water. And if you go back to like, some college courses, that bucket of water has inputs coming in, water coming in that's at a variable rate, and it has water going out at a variable rate. Well, That's differential equations. Like, that's really hard math. That's like, I couldn't do that class in college. It was like at my limits. And then actually it made a lot more sense to use them when I was applying them towards something, right?
Right.
But
Applied
that's a different
math is
story,
always
right?
better. Yeah.
But so cash flow is a more complex equation than we give it credit for sometimes. And yet I do actually want to manage my money, my cash flow by feel. Like, I want to get there. And so how do we do that? Well, I'm a teacher, right? So like in education, there's this idea that in English, there's only one word for to know. Whereas in other languages, there's multiple, right? So Spanish has some, but German is an interesting one because of the meanings of their words. It's Kenntnis and Wissenschaft. There's to know intellectually, and there's to know through experience, right?
Yes.
Through intuition.
I like that.
How do you develop that? Well, like, of course, you're typically going to start by having a concept in your head and you understand it intellectually, but you have to do it enough times through experience to get to the point where you have an intuition about, how to do the thing.
That's so true.
And when it comes to cash flow, there's a few what I call monsters on our hero's journey of money, right? And one of them is the fact that we don't have physical money anymore. It's mostly digital money, right? So we're not actually handing over the dollar bills, and we need to have systems for how to manage that. So how do we start to learn how to have the intuitive flow with our cash? Well, we have to create bumper lanes, systems for ourselves that act as bumper lanes through which we begin to understand, like just through intuition, how our cash flow is flowing, and then we can start to flow with it because we understand the rules of the game, right? We see the playing field from a 30,000-foot view, and because we can see the playing field, we are able to eventually develop that intuition that lets us flow.
And I like that analogy too, because it's almost like what you're saying too is like you're no longer just a spectator of the game.
100%.
You're in there.
You're in the game, but you're acting more as a coach, right? Who can see, like, hey, like maybe even the coach who's up in the box up there who's radioing down to the main coach, right? He's like, hey, from up here, I can see that what you need to do is you need to start whatever it is, running the ball, right? Or whatever, because I can see the playing field. Like, so that's where for me, we're able to create systems that allow us to perhaps spend less time in the details. Yeah. Because, man, this is something that I don't know the true statistics out there, but I have this feeling that more people spend, because of personal finance, traditional personal finance advice, I have this feeling that more people spend more time trying to restrict themselves and save, whatever it is, $50 a month on groceries by not allowing themselves to buy the organic blueberries, every single time they go to the grocery store, then people do spending that same amount of time, or actually a lot less time, understanding what is my savings rate and how do I increase it by 0.5% or 1% every single year? Because that latter question is life-changing. Whereas restricting yourself and relying on willpower every single time you go, like, that's not a system. That's where willpower is going to run out eventually, right? And so if you can just automate your savings and investments to increase your savings rate by 0.5% every year, like, that will change your life. Oh my goodness, you can look at the long-term results of what that means. You plug it in, go to investor.gov, find their compounding interest calculator, assume a return of 6% to be conservative, right? Run it for 30 years, 35, whatever. You can do all of that stuff to really see the numbers, but at the same time, like, really what matters is that you make that automated monthly contribution.
Well, and I like that too, because to your point, to Robert Kiyosaki, he actually said this term. He said that most people don't budget for a surplus, essentially, right?
Yeah.
They try to budget to just stay within their means and protect, like, all the whatever, and just shrink, but they don't budget for wealth creation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so it's almost like this mindset shift that you have to do. But I want to even, because you were talking about the systems, and we are actually right now talking about some very important key fundamentals, right? For WalletGyde, this is actually the core of WalletGyde, and we actually have it's a feature, a product feature, what we call it. It's an income summary.
Okay.
So, because like I said, I mean, WalletGyde was built literally when I was in my accounting class.
Yeah.
And well, not in my accounting class, but when I was in accounting and I was reviewing T accounts and I was reviewing income statements, balance sheets, and I was started to your point, like you were just saying, I started to become a participator in what was going on with my finances. I started to see my inflows, see my outflows, see the different types of inflows, see the different types of outflows. Understand that there's in your income, there's different types of income. There's, your passive, your, just your regular W-2 or, invest in. So there are different types of income that flows through your bank account. There's different types of expenses. There's fixed expenses. There's flex expenses. There's variables. So having an understanding of like this breakdown, and then after that, there's a leftover.
Yeah.
Are you either positive or are you negative, right? And so having, first of all, just even that level of detail, there is a dynamic to it as well, because of course you don't want to be OCD in the detail, but you definitely want to have that level of understanding of what's going on, and then find a way to zoom out of that.
Yes.
And then understand your cash flow and the metrics within that. So that was like a for me. Right. And so let's dive into that system, because right there, that was only the income summary. There's a whole other, product feature that within WalletGyde we also talk about, is the net worth summary. So between the income summary and the net worth summary, which measures your assets and your debts, and then gives you your net worth, between those two, if you want to call it, financial flows or measurements or documents that helps you understand the flow of your income, from both the income to the expense to the leftover, and then the assets to the debts to the net worth, and how they even correspond with each other.
Yeah.
Once you can understand those two relationships, I'm sure I didn't coin this term, but I'm gonna say this, by understanding a certain level of depth with your finances within those two financial summaries, you basically are understanding your personal economy.
Yes. The
right?
personal economy, yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I know most people don't, right? All we get taught about, if we even do, is the out there economy, right? The macro economy,
right.
What the financial markets are doing, what this is doing.
And we should get taught a lot more about that.
Right, we should.
Side note.
But we should even get. But what if, and this is the thing, this is like the really important, once I started understanding my income flows, my outflows, my cash flows, my assets, my debts, my net worth, how I'm doing with it, what emotional components that correlates to my decisions while I'm doing this, while I'm doing that. Understanding that, first of all, just made me, especially once I had the ability to start changing certain things, it made me understand I have way more control than I thought of my personal economy. And once you can start having control of your personal economy and start building your assets and start redirecting your flow into helping you build wealth, then regardless of what's going on in the external economy, I mean, the stock market can be dropping as much as it can for all you care. If you can look at your own personal economy and say, okay, wow, my stock market is going down, but my income is going up.
But there's a couple of things within that I think are really important to draw out.
Yeah.
And even to that last point, the stock market can drop. And we hear it out there right now, because it's happening right now, right?
LinkedIn just blew up.
That's just a buying opportunity, right?
Exactly.
Okay, but here's where the psychology comes into play. Is most people, when we are in a bull market, when things are high, that's when everybody is telling you, oh, you just got to buy the dip and buy. When it comes to time to buy the dip is when many people don't actually do it. And so that's where the systems come into play. There's one other system that you mentioned that I find to be really important psychologically along those same lines, which is, you mentioned, you go through the month, you have all your spending, your expenses, whatever, and you have this leftover. So what do you do with the leftover? I don't want you to have a leftover. I don't want a leftover. What I want is, because that thinking about the leftover and then contributing to savings and investments is how you don't do it, right?
It's true. I like that. Let's dive into that.
So I think that you have to be automating your savings and investments from the get-go to a level where you want them to be, because then the leftover, if you will, and there's ways to deal with this if you have variable income.
Sure.
But for many people, if you have a W-2 income, it can be actually really simple.
Sure.
The way that you deal with it is basically, and I can go into the whole system here, but basically the system that I ultimately recommend for most people is a simple iteration of the 50-30-20 principle,
Exactly.
right? The 50% needs, 30% wants, 20% savings and debt repayment. The problem with that system is that even though it's a very common, rule, if you will, out there in personal finance, like it doesn't really apply to today's economy. You have to adjust it a little bit to make it reasonable for people.
Yes.
And so what I tend to say is, and this is actually, you mentioned a guru, Ramit Sethi. I love that guy. He is incredible. Nice. But I had created an iteration of the 50-30-20 principle that when I haven't known about Ramit Sethi for very long. I've only known about for about a year, and I love what that guy talks about because partially because it was in line with some of the things that I had created. So in my kind of recommendation, and it's just an iteration of this 50-30-20 principle, right? It's not like it's hard to come across this, but what I had started recommending to people is, hey, you're going to try to get your living expenses to between 50 to 60%. So for me, living expenses were the needs, right?
Sure.
Ramit Sethi calls them something different, but it's all the same types of terms, right?
Oh, sure.
And his percentages were like super in line with what I had been recommending to people. I'm like, oh man, I like this guy already. And then the psychology stuff is like awesome. I'll tell you more about that.
Yeah.
But so 50 to 60% between living expenses. Then the recommendation would be, let's try to go for 5 to 10% savings, 10% investments. Savings are more for the short term goals, and investments, that's for the long term, the stuff that you're not even going to touch. You're not playing the stock market. You're not going to do any of that stuff, right? And people can do whatever they want to. This is just my recommendation for people who are not like already an accounting nerd, right? Or whatever the case is. And then the last number is the one where I really took a term from Ramit Sethi because it's so accurate. The last number is, I used to call my Fun and BS account, which comes from Paco de Leon, also another
what you
great,
call it?
My Fun and BS account.
My fun
and BS, right? Like I get to do what I want. With this, right? And that actually comes from Paco de Leon, who's another influencer or guru
finance
out there. She is awesome. She wrote a book called what was it? Finance for the People. Highly recommended. So I really like what she's doing. But basically that's your wants. And what Ramit Sethi called it is your guilt-free spending. And I'm like, that is so perfect, right? How many of us feel guilty when we spend on ourselves, right? Because we grew up hearing money doesn't grow on trees or whatever we heard, right? A million times.
Right.
And so that basically the idea with that is when you look at the playing field and you know what your percentages are, then you know what your guilt-free spending number is every single month. So if that comes out to be $500 a month or $1,500 a month, whatever it is, you know that is a separate guilt-free spending account that you can live for the now because you've already done the planning for the future. You have automated your savings and investment contributions. Now, this is where there is a little bit of input needed when you start to put the numbers into the system and look at it, because I think there's a couple things that people have to understand in order to make it all work for them, and many of them are psychological. One of them is people will first go and plug their numbers in, and it's a blocker for many people because the traditional financial advice is, in order to figure out what your numbers are, and this is where like WalletGyde is going to have some amazing tools. And we have some tools within our mobile banking app. Also, I highly encourage people to come check out their local credit unions, but also like your bank probably has something like this, unless it's one of the really big ones and they don't look out for people as much. But there's a tool within there where basically instead of taking the traditional personal financial advice to try to figure out what are my living expenses, which traditionally it's like, hey, go and pull your last several statements from all of your spending cards, whether credit cards, debit cards, and pull out the different colored highlighters and go and highlight all of the places where you had groceries or gas, and then, average it out so that you actually know your living expense numbers. That's a blocker for most people, right?
Yeah.
And so what WalletGyde is going to be able to do, what mobile apps can do, is they can categorize, and there's a little bit of tuning needed, but they can categorize all of that automatically for you. So from what I do in mine is, and you only have to do it once and maybe update it every year or whatever if things change. But in general, you're trying to maintain your standard of living, because once you raise your standard of living too much, it becomes hard to go back to a perceived lower standard of living, right? And so what you'll do is just go back a year, let's say, and highlight and select, okay, gas. Oh, that came out to this. Okay, divide it by 12. Cool. There's my gas spending monthly average, right?
Yes.
Same thing for groceries, right? Put in your living expenses, and what most people find, and this is the second piece, is what most people find is like, shoot, your recommendation is between 50 and 60%, and my living expenses are 80% or 70%, right? Something much higher than that.
Sure.
Does that need to be fixed immediately? It depends on your situation, right? Because you can really do three things in terms of your financial systems. Like, you can do nothing, which you're probably going to get similar results. You can make small incremental changes over time, which if you're young, you can probably expect that your income's going to continue to increase. And therefore, like, that number will go down naturally over time, so long as you maintain your standard of living, right? You're not like balling out just because you got a raise or whatever. Or you can make big changes, and big changes come with the pros and cons associated with them, right? So once you look at that, if you see that your living expenses are at 80% or whatever, that can be, if you're doing small incremental changes over time, that can be a goalpost where you move towards it over time. But simply knowing that number and checking in on it, let's say once a month or every couple of months or yearly even, you're moving towards that goalpost over time, and that's what allows you to move closer and closer to it.
No, and I love the breakdown that you just did there. And as you were talking, it made me remember certain things too, to just even really, because right now we're still basically on the systems, right?
Yeah.
Of building that foundation. And it's so important. We talked about a lot of different key things, the 50-30-20 rule. I like to call them financial principles.
Yes,
right?
Thank you.
There's so many principles out there. And I remember when, us as finance nerds, we're like, oh, give us the principles. What are they? And so I went down the deep end, just like learning all the different principles. What are they? What are they? The 50-30-20, the pay yourself first, the snowball method, the this, the that. And now to the whatever common person, it could feel overwhelming, and even to a financial nerd too, it can still be a bit like, oh, this is a lot. But what for me that I started realizing is, and you even said it too, it's like, well, first of all, like, we're all different people. We're all going to have different stories.
Exactly.
We're going to have different trails of our money.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's not the 50-30-20. I always look at it as parameters. It's not one size fits all.
Yeah.
To your point, like, if you're living in Denver, Colorado, and someone's living in New York City, your 50-30-20, your needs, which your housing is involved in, that needs, is good. That 50% is going to be a much different 50% than someone's living in, like, actually Alabama. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Or Kansas City or
right.
Yeah.
And
100%.
so cost of living depends on where they do live, and then so the stories are always going to be shifted.
And this is what brings me back to those gurus, because it's so funny that we jumped, because we're nerds, right? We jumped straight into like the systems and the numbers.
And it's important.
But that's the thing, is that ultimately, like, for me, I actually typically, when I do presentations, when I talk to people, like, we don't talk about the numbers until far into it.
Makes sense.
Part of the reason for that is because of what we started this conversation with, that we all come to money from that different perspective. But also the reason is because we have to know our numbers on some level in order to have successful financial systems. But the numbers, the only reason that we use them is because they allow us to have those rich conversations about how we want to use money to design the lives we want to live.
Absolutely.
Like, the numbers need to be there, but they're not the starting place. And they're also not the finishing place. They're the place where we see the playing field, and then we come back and say, all right, what are we going to do with this to live our lives.
And I like how you said that, because we created a PDF that talks about your personal financial journey, right? Because we all start from point A, and we want to get to point wherever, right? B or D or Z, whatever, right? And in that journey, to your point, what the numbers do is they give you awareness, right?
100%.
There's so many people
Yeah.
that are just, and you're gonna love this statement, because we're both on the same mission, bombarded with marketing and consumerism, and unconsciously find themselves spending money on things they don't even need.
Yes.
And they're not even aware
Right.
of their finances.
Yeah.
And it's almost like this cycle that they get into, and of course, like, then all the anxiety and all these things start piling up, because they not only sometimes they don't know where they stand, they don't even want to know, because they know it's probably bad.
Yeah, I mean, it's very easy to kind of like close your eyes and just be like, I'm just not, it'll hopefully work itself out, right?
Right. And so that awareness piece, by the way, which I always say this too, it's super important to realize the emotional aspect of money.
Yeah.
And it is a lot. So, and this is why I like to introduce the importance of a financial coach.
Yes.
Right? Because it's not easy to sit there and look at how bad you've been doing with your money. It's not easy, right?
There's a couple of pieces that come to mind here. So okay, I'll start by bringing us back to these gurus.
Yes.
So I think my gurus may be different than a lot of people's out there.
Okay.
And part of that's because I'm like a little bit too much of a nerd, but they really opened my eyes to the money psychology side of things. And so my big gurus that I want to highlight are Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky.
Huh.
And Richard Thaler, their disciple, if you will.
Of what?
So have you heard of these two?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so they wrote this book called Thinking Fast and Slow, right? And it's like this thick. It's horribly boring. Like I don't recommend it to
it's not
basically
is it a
anybody.
finance book?
And it's not a finance book.
Okay.
They won a Nobel Prize in economics despite the fact that they were psychologists. And basically, to summarize what they did, and I mean, these guys are unbelievable. Like, I highly recommend people look into them a little bit more. Michael Lewis wrote a book about them, which is much more entertaining than their book.
Huh.
But basically what these guys said is they came to the world of economics and they said, hey, economists, you know how for years you all have said that human beings are rational actors that will seek to maximize their economic utility? No, we're not. Like, we're human beings. We make decisions emotionally, and specifically what they said is we make decisions using heuristics, which are mental shortcuts, right? And sometimes those mental shortcuts are emotions, and sometimes they're different things. And so they started putting together a list of all of these ways in which we make these decisions in a faulty manner. And I could go way down the rabbit hole of showing you some of these tricks. And actually in my presentations, I do some of them where I ask people questions that plays the tricks on them so that they come to the wrong answer and then go, well, how'd you do that? You know, and they're like, oh, wait, I know how you did that. You set me up with the availability heuristic or whatever it is, right? But the idea is that basically they said, hey, if we can start to, the reason that we create these mental shortcuts is because evolutionarily it saves us a lot of energy, right? If I can make a decision quickly without using any mental energy because it gets me to the right answer 90% of the time, then like I'm saving that mental energy. But that there are, let's say 10% of those types of mental shortcuts that we use that we get systematically wrong. And so can we identify those in order to tell us how to basically make better financial decisions and catch ourselves when we do a faulty mental shortcut? Sure. So Richard Thaler is one of their disciples. He actually wrote a great book. He was like a Princeton economist. He still is an economist. Wow. His book that I highly recommend, I love it, is called Misbehaving. And it is his story of becoming an economics professor that basically said to, the whole economics industry, like, you guys are wrong. Like, people make decisions in these ways. So that part of the psychology is what really kind of got me started going on the psychological side of things. Oh, sure. And so there were a couple of other threads there, but I'll pause there just to say that those are two guys. Oh, one more I'll say before, just in terms of gurus, is there's a guy named Jacob Goldstein. He used to host Planet Money. He wrote this book called, what was it called? Money, The Story of a Made Up Thing. And I think it is worth everybody reading it because it's entertaining and it goes through the history of money and the fact that it is just a system that we made up. It has continuously changed through time, and it will continue to change in the future, including, and I know you'll like this side of it, he goes into some of the ideas behind crypto and some of the new technologies and how that will, potentially interact in the world. So it's a really interesting read, and it helps us understand the idea behind this made up thing that we use to live our lives and design the lives we want to live.
Well, I mean, it's this medium of exchange, right?
Yeah.
That initially started. I mean, we go back into, not even if you want to go, I was about to go all the way back to the Neanderthals or like but even early caveman, it wasn't a piece of paper. It was literally, rocks and barter. Yeah, barter. Yeah.
But that takes a long time, right? Paper makes it into a much more convenient exchange. And now we're to the point where it's so convenient, digital. We just tap our phone and we move on, right? And so we have to think about that even when we're, let's say, we have kids or something, we're trying to teach them how to manage their money. We have to think about how that changes the psychology.
Right. Well, it's a social contract.
Yes.
Right? It's turned into a social contract that was initially backed by something, gold. Right?
And Jacob Goldstein goes heavily into the story of getting off of the gold standard.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. And I think we should be taught about that too,
Sure.
Because that then goes into, Keynesian economics and some of the lessons that we have not learned today from his work, right?
Oh my goodness.
We certainly learned the lesson of, in a recession, stimulate. I don't think we learned to cut back in the good times.
So what is really interesting, I was actually talking to ChatGPT earlier today because I have full-on conversations, by the way, with ChatGPT. And it's actually literally become my economics professor, I must say. And it reminded me, because I remember I actually read about all of this stuff in the past too, about the Bretton Woods, if you want to call it system or agreement, and when the economy was actually backed by gold, and how around 1971, essentially, and this is so important, the rules of money changed.
Yes,
right. And so, and I'm so glad we're having this podcast too, because I was talking about this earlier to ChatGPT today, and now I can bring it up. And so I would love to even have this conversation, because here's the problem, or here's the situation: the rules of money changed.
Yes.
Meaning the money is not backed by gold anymore, meaning that money is now being and can be printed at whatever rate. Now, of course, we do have a monetary system in place to try to, control the monetary policies. But at the end of the day, money can now be abundant in a sense of printing, which causes devaluation, right, of the dollar. And I was actually I looked at the statistics between the wages around 1970 till now versus the inflation. So wages versus inflation is stagnating, and actually even not even keeping up with the inflation as a result of the money printing. So now,
and other factors
and other factors for sure. But here's the situation: the only people that are now benefiting with this new rules are the ones that even know that it happened.
Yeah. I mean, so just because I can't get out of my mind, on the gold piece, going off the gold standard, that was Roosevelt. So that was during the Great Depression. So before, it was not before 71. But anyway, but yeah. So it's interesting because I think all of this is really valuable to think about from a broad economic perspective because of the inequities that we have seen, and there's a lot of different threads that you could take within that. But if you go back into some of the personal financial systems that result from this idea of money psychology, because basically what you're getting at is like, it's really valuable for us to understand the rules of the game, right?
100%.
And sometimes the reason that I like to come back to this personal side is because I want to say a couple of things about the money psychology, which is really where we start the conversation before we get into the numbers. And the reason that I like this is because it allows us to tell our own stories rather than necessarily just blame the invisible force out there that's like, you know, the people with the money or who know the rules of the game or whatever the case is. And that is the fact that you know, on the money psychology side of things, I mentioned the fact like we all come to money with a different perspective, right? And that's our individual perspective. But the things that I like to bring up for people just to discuss our own stories even are like, you know, a lot of times the question that I'll ask people, and this is actually one that Ramit Sethi taught me about, is just a super simple question of like, what are the first 3 words that come to mind when you think about money?
Yeah.
Right? Just to like start to get to know people. And one of the stories that I found interesting there is that, you know, there are all these different influences when it comes to our money. There's cultural influences, there's relationships, and how do those start to play in to dynamics? Well, there was this story of a couple that when they were asked what are the first 3 words that come to mind about money, like one of them has all these positive terms, right? Like fun, freedom, future. And then like the partner is like, whoa, oh my goodness. Like what comes to mind for me is, and it's a very common one, right, is stress, the unknown, and like, you know, it's this black box that you don't know what's happening inside it, but you just gotta like play the game anyway, and you don't, you know. And so the thing that I think's interesting there is that's a relationship. So we already come to money with an individual perspective that came from our parents or whatever. Then you go and start to have a relationship, and your partner is thinking about money in that positive sense, and you're thinking about, and we never discuss the fact that when we're talking about money, we're doing this, right? So that is a money dynamic, right? Where there's more than one person involved in the money decisions. And so then how do we start to have those conversations for perspective expansion and for understanding? And then there's the cultural level too, right? And the thing that I find interesting about the cultural level is, this is another thing that comes from my teacher background, right? But I think that one of the main purposes of education is to teach perspective expansion. Meaning, like, a lot of people will have a conversation to win the discussion, right? Convince the other person of their point. And, like, how different would the world look if we go into a conversation to try to understand, like, to be able to step into somebody else's shoes and to understand the way that they see things. How do you see money, right? Which, like, you know, this is like, I'd be curious if you're interested to do this. I would totally love to hear more. Let's do it. But you know, when you think about the perspective expansion piece, one of the stories that comes to mind for me that blew my mind and that also helped me to understand how to even engage in some of these coaching conversations with the widely diverse community that we live in is there was this story from a woman who taught herself personal finance. And she had learned it through kind of the traditional methods, right? She went out and read all the books out there and started, you know, you try to read the books and there's going to be different opinions. You got to integrate them into systems that actually work for you. And so she had gone through that whole process and she came up with something that she really liked. And in her retelling of the story, she's like, yeah, I brought it back to my family, and my family's like, no. Like, this isn't how we interact with money. It's not how we talk about money. And in her telling of it, she's like, well, like, the reason was because I come from a Latin family, and this isn't true anymore. Like, we have way more books that are written from diverse perspectives now. But at the time, she's like, most of the books out there are written from one perspective, which is the perspective of a money-motivated white male, right? And, like, in her example of coming from a Latin family, like, she's like, money-motivated Latin white males oftentimes, and this is a generality, but really, oftentimes they think about money from a very individualistic perspective, whereas a generality, and true for her family, her Latin family thinks about money from a very communal perspective, right? This is us. They were all in it together, right? And so cultural values, there's this saying in business, which I know you've probably heard, right? It comes from somewhere where they're like, culture each strategy for breakfast, right? Like you're not going to run Google by having the best strategy. You have to create the culture and the people build it from there. Well, if you think about the cultures that we grew up in that have existed for thousands of years, right? Like that is a powerful force that we have to begin to like have those conversations and expand our perspectives to then be able to engage in a conversation with our perhaps romantic partner who comes from a different perspective or a different culture or whatever the case is, right? Wow. So like, how do you do that? That's the reason that a financial coach is so much more than one spreadsheet on a budget, right?
So much more. And there's a good name and a good shout out to a good financial coach, Jordan Peddleton, right? Because you were right, Jordan Peddleton. Shout out to Jordan, right? I know she's gonna be. We're gonna send her this podcast.
Another one,
because she's a relationship coach, and you hit it on the nail in terms of how different partners have different perspectives. So,
and my wife and I'm a financial coach, right? Like and presenter and stuff. But like I do this. My wife and I do coaching with Jordan because
love it.
It's like I can't. This is what I do. Also, I need somebody to help me with that. Right.
Every coach you do, I have a coach myself.
Yes. Right.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I don't know if you know Yannick, but he's a good coach of mine. But yeah, to your point, like, shout out to, Jordan, and because yes, you absolutely need. There's so many dynamics there between partners, and I think you even said something else too that I'm trying to also remember. I mean, you said a lot you said a lot of great and good stuff in that sequence, and I was trying to actually recall because I had another thing I wanted to pull out, but like I said, shout out to Jordan on that money, because she's the go-to when it comes to money and or couples and relationships, and if anything, she's one of our great friends, isn't she?
She's amazing.
I mean, we are going to be due to have all three of us. On a podcast. I wanted to at least first go you and I, but Jordan definitely, she's going to be hopping on one of our podcasts as well. But yeah, no, you said a lot of good stuff there.
I was curious though, because you said you'd be open to it.
Okay, yeah.
So what are the first three words that come to mind for you?
Well, and I'm glad you even asked me that too, because you said something, culture. That was exactly what it was. And oh my gosh, so much to unpack with this, but I'll keep it high level too, and try to simplify it, because I always like to take things on a philosophical standpoint. And one of the cool things about philosophers or whatever is they always try to figure out the big picture first, right? Yeah. And if you look at the big picture of, to your point, when you even made that statement, well, the current, if I could remember exactly, you said when you were talking about the Latin woman versus, the white male, in terms of their perspectives of how they operate with money is very different due to culture. And I would even go as far to understand is the system.
Yes.
Right? So capitalism, and I've read Adam Smith and I've read Karl Marx.
Yeah.
I've read both perspectives. You even mentioned the importance of understanding perspectives, right? And it's so important to definitely understand first of all, what capitalism brings, the good and the bad.
Right.
I think, unfortunately, sometimes we only try to focus on only the good, and we don't understand that in an environment, like I said, if you look at it philosophically, in that environment, it will cause people to behave a certain sort of way. So in terms of that individualistic behavior is stemmed from a system.
Yes.
And so that's how I see it. So like, as a result, due to just look at our framework of how the GDP, the economy is kind of built around a GDP, and we must always have growth and then record it. There's nothing necessarily wrong, by the way, with the importance of having a growth mentality, but if you're doing it at that's the only goal without the without like factoring in the well-being of the consumers and of just individuals in general, well, that's going to have a negative long-term effect in a society, in any society.
100%.
Right? So I know that was more of like just that high level, but then, so that's what's going on a high level. It's more of a systematic issue that is causing a certain, it's causing society to act in a certain way.
Right.
Where it's like, money first, me, not you, not communal. And so if you even look at the terms, a lot of people, and we've also even been trained to believe these different, I remember when I was studying economics, you have all these different isms, right? Capitalism, socialism, communism. If you really look at the definition of it, there's a key word in communism called community.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, like, inherently, like, don't you want to be communal? But yet, you better not be communist. But then, that's what I'm trying to say. It's like we're trained in all these to believe in all these certain things. But when you actually look at it, and if you even look at capitalism in itself right now, the current capitalism that we are currently operating in is not purely capitalistic.
Right.
Government is still very much involved. Or even communism that you see, if you want to call China, it's not purely communistic.
Right. Yeah.
And socialism. So you look at all these different, like I said, frameworks, economic frameworks, and I believe these frameworks are not inherently wrong.
No, yeah.
It's the people.
Yeah. Well, but this is also where you can go into a lot of perspectives that
Exactly.
allow people to get beyond some of the things that were kind of, like I'll say, there are some heroes of mine that are, physicists, and I think it was maybe, because like we're nerds across the spectrum, right? But so I think it was maybe Niels Bohr, or maybe it was like Richard Feynman has this quote, right, about like, the opposite of a truth is a falsehood, but the opposite of a profound truth is another profound truth, right? Like there are these moments where you have to be able to hold two contradictory truths at once because they both are true. And this is also where we like to define things into, no, it's either wrong or right, or it's this or that, right? And so, like, to your point, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of systems where, communism isn't only communism or capitalism isn't only capitalism. And you could go down those rabbit holes, but I'm not an expert in that. I won't even go down that. I'll just simply say, for me, when I was growing up, I thought that, money was the root of all evil, that it could cause businesses to do unethical things. And that is certainly true, right? Like there's a reason that today I work at a business that is a credit union, which is a not-for-profit community chartered organization, right? It allows us to not only be beholden to investors who want a return on their profit, but it allows us instead to have it written into our community-based charter to say, hey, how do we do good back into the community? Because any profits go back to our members and to the community, right? And yet, I also believe something very fundamentally different about for-profit businesses now than I did as a kid, which is that like a for-profit business is providing a value exchange to the world, right? They should get paid for what they do. And it is natural for them to try to maximize that profitability. And so if you think from the perspective of a small business owner or even a big entrepreneur, like a business is starting a movement because you have a better vision of the world, right? You have a vision where the world is better with an app that allows people to understand their finances from the 30,000-foot view and connect them with financial coaches when they need it, right? And you build that business by converting one person, one customer, towards converting them to your movement, one person at a time. And that movement grows and people get excited about it and they tell other people about it. And then you can start adding in the marketing or whatever, right? Or the expenses, let's say. But like that vision of business being a value exchange and a movement where you're moving towards a better world is a very different one that I didn't think about as much when I was growing up. And you can go into all the details of like, the incentives and the way that things are structured with investors. And there's a lot of really good arguments out there also that not-for-profit organizations aren't as efficient as for-profit because the single metric of having shareholder return of value does drive more productivity, let's say, and then you can go back and argue, well, and not for, right? And so you can go back and forth on these, but it's like, I think that exploring those shades of gray and understanding those different perspectives is really valuable.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I actually even want to go back to, because to truly answer your question about the culture thing, then I'll add on to, if you can remind me about what you just said there too about the growth in the GDP, because I actually have something about that. But I would say, because culture, I mean, it's really important to understand that every culture does not only have their perspective about money, but have been treated differently about, know, with money.
Yes.
I mean, the black community or the minority community went through something called redlining. A lot of people don't even understand what that is. Prevented, that community from even having access to, home ownership and all these very important things, which, by the way, excuse me, which, by the way, is foundational, right?
Yeah.
When it comes to wealth building and wealth creation. And so then if you then limit a certain community from even participating, now, of course, fortunately, those things don't exist anymore. But if that was a situation, absolutely, they're going to have a certain perspective about money that another culture is not going to have. So I think talking about those lived experiences, like, based on where you grew up, who you are, your culture, like you mentioned, you're absolutely going to have a lived experience about money and a perspective about money. I actually had a really phenomenal guy on our podcast, I think later last year, Prince Dykes, shout out to Prince Dykes, did a phenomenal podcast, and he talked about that. And even when he was growing up, his parents were growing up, they would hide money behind the mattress, because that's all they knew.
Right.
Yeah. And and he was the one that even brought up the conversation about redlining and all these things that, and this is, by the way, this is just the reality, right? There's just the reality of the situation, that this was a lived experience as it pertained to money to this certain community. And so as a result, of course, they're going to have a certain perspective and all these things about money that they're going to have to overcome.
Right. So then did you have 3 words that came to mind? Because I had another question for you, which might relate too, which is, do you have phrases that come to mind that you heard as a kid over and over again?
Yeah, well, oh my gosh. I mean, I came to this country as an immigrant, from Nigeria. And so, I grew up, remembering. And now, of course, when you're coming from Nigeria, at least where we actually came as refugees, So, I mean, of course, now and back in Nigeria, there are people that are extremely well off. Yeah. And then there are, of course, a lot of people that are, especially back then, not so well off. Yeah. Right. And unfortunately, the middle class needs to be better in Nigeria. And unfortunately, I was part of that not so well off, especially coming in as a refugee. So I grew up.
And what age was this?
This was when I was 5.
Okay.
So I grew up, when I came to this country, I was just like, oh, like the movies. Yeah. Like opportunity. Oh, all I saw was opportunity. Right. Like, oh, look at this, look at that. And then I looked within the family and it was like, oh, okay, wow. So I see, we are living very different from those that have. And so for me as a young kid, I was always like, I need to figure out how to have. Like, what is it? And these questions started coming into my mind, like, why is it that this family lives like this and this family lives like that, or we live like this versus that family? And so those questions is what actually started building. I didn't even know back then, but started building the foundation of WalletGyde that was going to be birthed down the line, because I knew, I was like, look, I'm going to be very successful because first of all, I've had a lived experience of what it looks like when you're not successful. Yeah. Right? When you're starting off, which, whatever. We were still, when we were kids, we were having fun. I didn't realize it, but we were on the whole food stamp stuff, the typical immigrant family, coming into this country and trying your best to, make it.
Yeah.
But it's a beautiful story too, though, if you look back and you see how that can then motivate you to become very successful, right? And that's exactly what. So for me, like, money was always it was a motivational factor,
Right.
really.
Yeah.
And then as a result, it's actually what stirred the pot of wanting for me to get into accounting, get into finance, learn that, hey, it's not a mystery why this family is more successful than that family.
Right. Yeah.
And then I even started realizing it's not a mystery why then on a macro level. So I loved economics because when I started looking at micro versus macro economics, started looking at the individual household versus the, country.
Yeah.
And then I also started to understand that even countries have financial statements. They also have assets and liabilities, and so a country can even operate like an individual. And then I started realizing that, okay, so the reason why we have first world countries and third world countries is also based off of finances.
So then, like, I can see a lot of threads of how, like, your story made you into the passionate entrepreneurial individual that you are today. What do you think the biggest, if you could sum them up, like, what are the biggest lessons that you took from that experience growing up?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the biggest for me was like, oh wow, like, I don't, and people don't like when I say like this term, like it's a game, but like it is truly a, if maybe another word other than game is there's a system to what makes people successful and what doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And once you understand that system, and once you understand these rules, once you understand how it works, these insights, you can actually succeed. That was the biggest for me. I was like, oh, it's not a mystery. Because, you know, when sometimes you think, how like you look at all these successful people, like sometimes you wonder, like, oh my God, how is this person so successful? How are they making so much money?
Right.
How is Bill Gates or Warren Buffett a billionaire, or this, or, and of course there's, sometimes your career, and you have athletes and they're based off of talent, you're successful. And but there are also a whole lot of other people. You look at Forbes, I mean, there's hundreds of people on that Forbes list that they had to learn.
Yes. Well, but this brings a question to mind for me, which is, another one of the monsters that I list on our hero's journey of personal finance is comparison, right? And in today's world, it is really easy to look at social media and to see Bill Gates or whoever, the exceptions rather than the rule, I think. And it's also really easy to look at Jack and Jill next door who are going on vacation what seems like X number of times a year. And because social media is not representative of the reality of our lives, it's highlighting the best parts of it. And as Morgan Housel says, right, like you can often see rich, right, because people are driving the freaking Cybertruck or the Ferrari down the street. But that Cybertruck could be financed on a lease with 50% of that person's income, right? Whereas Jeff Bezos can be driving down the street, another exception rather than the rule, but still could be driving down the street in his Toyota Camry and you don't see wealth because it's all being shoved into these investment accounts that are growing. And so the thing that I'm curious about is, I think, what you're hinting at makes me think that sometimes the definition of success gets confined to like the exceptions, whereas I think also a lot of people can be extremely happy running a small business that does not have aspirations to, clear $1 billion a year or something crazy like that, but instead to be, going back to our point earlier about business and value exchange, to be serving your community. And sometimes we get in this boat of growth where we think that a small business is a smaller version of Google, right? Where you need to go and raise capital and you don't even know what that means. So you're like, I've heard I should do a friends and family round or whatever the case is, but that you're going to be growth first, because if you're building Google, if you're building the next platform that's maybe a WalletGyde going to serve 100 million users, then there are certain amounts of product talent, things like that you need to recruit and get in place and build for that platform to serve 100 million users. And the asymmetric upside, if you will, on that, and I'm thinking from an investor's perspective now, the asymmetric upside on that is very high, right? But venture capital isn't for every business either. And for small businesses, oftentimes the idea of starting that movement that you're starting one person at a time as being profit first can be highly valuable to think about also. And running that business from a, maybe having smaller aspirations, but having that quality of life balance. So anyway, that's a long way of me saying, like, how do you, you're still building what is going to be a massive platform, but also how are you thinking about the balance of like achieving success that's like, billionaire status versus like, I want to serve people and like make a good living, but are you still like, how do you interpret that now?
First of all, I love this question. And because, and it's interesting, you're the one asking me questions now. I thought I was going to be asking. We did say we were going to have a nice dialogue. We were talking about this off the record, actually, prior to this, and we talked about this, and so to answer the question, I think everyone has to have some sort of, if you want to call it like mission-driven orientation, some sort of like, I don't know if you want to call it like a higher power or a cause.
Yeah.
Right? And fortunately for me, that's always been the thing.
Yeah.
Right? I've always had a purpose and a reason and an understanding why.
Yeah.
I guess if you want to say why I'm here, what my responsibilities are. And WalletGyde, like I said, coming from how I started and, where I am now and what I know I need to accomplish has always been that mission for mine. So, yes, when I was younger and I saw the nice cars and the success and I was like, when you're young you want those things and you're like, it'd be nice to be on Forbes list and it would be nice. I studied, I read. So there's this history channel called The Man That Built America that it broke down the Andrew Carnegies of the world, the JP Morgans. I studied the whole American capitalistic system. I went down the deep hole with understanding capitalism. Right? I can throw the list. There's some stuff I recommend not to read that I read. That is probably not a good thing to know about. But nevertheless, like, I read all that and I was like, oh, wow, like, I want to be successful. And then, you get older, fortunately, thankfully, and you realize it's not about the money. It's about the mission. It's like, what are you trying to solve? And for me, I knew it was always making sure, first of all, that I was set financially. I understood the rules of money, and then I was taking care of the people that I care about, right? My family, my all those, and then of course that'll solving a major problem that it wasn't only very tied to me, but that ironically a lot of other people are also struggling with too, right? And then not only people but countries.
Yes.
So it brought me right back to my home country, Nigeria, and it made me realize, oh my goodness, on a cash flow basis with Nigeria, with the whole continent of Africa, let's look at that, right? Let's look at the way that the monetary policies operate. This is my economic side kicking in, but the World Bank, versus and how the money's flown from the World Bank to the different African nations, and what is their fiscal policies around making sure the funds that are flowing through, right, these nations are actually operating and operating into activities that is generating revenue for the nation and for the people, and creating layers of like, economic benefits for the people.
So then, those are like lofty visions, and it's like how do you then bring it down to, like, all right, well, I can't solve all the world's problems, but what I can do is create,
a great app
that could translate between countries.
Exactly.
But also I sense that could be the next challenge, right, is
Yeah.
okay, like let's launch this thing, and I sense that you're focusing on the U.S. at
Oh, yeah.
first, at least,
And
but
then-
then that's the whole next iteration, right?
Yes.
Is okay, get it going, let it run, have it help people here,
Yeah.
and the North Star metric versus top KPI, right?
Yeah.
The idea of what is businesses often will think about the KPI, what's the value that we're extracting from the community, but just as important is keeping track of the North Star metric, which is what value are you putting into the community,
Yes.
and how is that helping the people that you serve, because then that creates the value exchange, right? But then like you get that going here, but then to translate it to a different culture, to a different
Yes.
country, will be the next iteration. So is that the big
100
vision?
You know, I never knew it was. I kid you not, Marsha. I didn't know this until just recently.
Wow.
Something was telling me. Like I said, it's mission driven, right? And I was mission driven. I was like, look, I actually need to. Now, of course, first things first. I got to establish myself, make sure WalletGyde does what it needs to do here in the States, and of course with the workshops and the podcasts that we're doing, and sharing, the knowledge and building a community. The community is so important. And that's, if there's anything that I get really excited about WalletGyde, is the fact that not only, right, are we going to be super high tech, and I'm talking like, I mean, we're all in AI. Like we're creating WalletGyde AI, like a whole, essentially a virtual financial assistant,
which is going to help
in
with
addition
that
to
stuff
the
where
financial
people
coach.
don't want to go into all the
Exactly.
details, and so they can see the playing field more easily and actually take ownership of their finances.
100%.
Awesome.
So
I love it.
we're when it comes to tech and AI and all that, oh my God. Matter of fact, I have another podcast only on AI coming up pretty soon. So that's going to be exciting. But with that being in mind, we also understand the importance of personal touch.
Yes.
We also understand the importance of workshops, podcasts.
Well, because again, it goes back to that
People.
balance of like, it's not just the numbers.
Yeah.
That's why it's so valuable
Yes.
to link with that financial coach afterwards, to start to say like, hey, let's look at your numbers. Maybe they serve a purpose of like helping to keep you on track or helping you with something technical. But like ultimately the goal is, okay, now we're looking at our numbers and like, hey, let's throw out a scenario, right? Okay, so I put all my numbers in. My living expenses are at 80%, right? And I look and I go to the dashboard page of what I provide to people as a cash flow. It's a cash flow spreadsheet. It's just a resource that people can use. There's a whole menu of options out there, right? If there's another one that's better for people, hey, use that and let's talk about it and do the thing. Right?
Sure.
But let's use the cash flow spreadsheet, and your living expenses are at 80%. You go to the dashboard page and you see, because the dashboard has all the important numbers, right? And it's got a net worth calculator too or whatever. But you look at it and you're like, shoot, my housing expense ratio is at 38%, right? And, the reason that's an important number is because housing is the big rock in our financial jars, right? Like to your point earlier, if you look back economically, if you inflation adjust from 1980 to 2022, and those are just the most recent numbers that I pulled, so they're on top of my head,
Sure.
is starting salary of the bachelor's degree and family median income are basically the same after you adjust for inflation. And yet the three big rocks in our financial jars, out of many, but I'll just list three. Housing is almost double. Student debt, cost of tuition, books, all of those things is over double. And not everybody has this one, but it's a huge factor also is childcare is almost double, right? And so our jars are only so big. And so when the big rocks are that much bigger, then the margin for error is thinner. So, okay, so you're at 80% and your housing expense is a big component of that, right? Let's say that you're young, you're 26 years old, single, and you're like, okay, my housing expense ratio is at 38%, and I also want to go see my family, and I want to go on one vacation a year, and like, it's not adding up. I don't have, I'm paycheck to paycheck every month, and I don't have any savings or expenses. I don't have a long-term emergency reserve to draw from when my car breaks down, because I know that's going to happen, and I'm scrambling for the money, right? Okay, so what do you do? And this is where it's like, well, how do you start to ask, what do you intentionally, and an easy example, and I'm just giving this example because it's like, all right, I've set up this scenario with a high housing expense ratio, is let's talk about a big change. You could get a roommate. right? And what does that look like? If you were to get a room, and that comes with a whole other set of logistics. You got to figure out if it's even possible. Then you got to do tenant selection. You got to choose the right person. You got to make sure that you're on the same page about the fact that there are never dishes in the sink, or it's okay to have dishes in whatever it is, right? And so it's a whole nother thing. But if that was to cut your housing expense ratio, let's not even say in half, let's say cut it to 60% of what it was, then that makes such a massive difference. You can watch this happen on the spreadsheet. Your living expense ratio drops to 55% or whatever it is all of a sudden, and you're like, whoa, what do I do with the rest of that? Well, I could contribute this to investments, this to savings. I can let my income increase over time, right? That's a huge change. But at the same time, when I propose that to people, sometimes they're like, I would never have a roommate, right? And so then the question comes up, okay, well, like, let's get really intentional about what it is you want in your life, because you're also wanting to, I sense that you really value seeing your family because you're going on a trip. You don't live by your family anymore, and you go take a trip to see them once a year, and you want to go on one awesome vacation a year. That's super cool, but if, like, there are constraints. So when it comes down to it, push comes to shove, tell me, what do you value more? Having this space to yourself that's really nice or whatever it is, and housing expenses are always high, so it's hard, but like having this space to yourself every single day, do you rejoice in that? Or are you like, no, I could deal with a roommate if it meant I got to see my family and take one badass trip a year, right? And a lot of times people are like, they know it's one or the other, right? It's like, no, I value the space to myself. Like, I'll get to the point where I'll work on my income. I'll do resume optimization, interview skills, networking. Like, I work on those things with people all the time. Some great success stories. One kid who just got a job that is double his previous salary after we've done like 6 months of interview skills, networking, resume optimization. But still, point is that like many times people are, when faced with the decision, like, okay, income, that's a long-term game to increase that over time. But like when it comes down to it, I love having my house to myself, or I love that badass trip once a year, and I can deal with a roommate for the rest of the year, right? And those are the types of conversations that are a little bit more granular and specific, but that's the type of stuff that like so often people go in and they're like, it's like, all right, what do you want to do? And they're like, I want to cut my grocery bill by $50 a month, and I should not have so many subscriptions. Well, subscriptions can be a big issue, but also if we're talking about $50 on grocery bill and $50 on subscription, then that $100 a month, great. But at the same time, it pales in comparison to that bigger decision of deciding to bring on a roommate or not take that trip a year, right? And that changes the game in terms of your savings rate, which then changes the whole long-term game, right? And then that's not even including the extra layer of people who have credit card debt. Because credit card debt, you can go in and look at the numbers, but if I can possibly just figure out how to have $100 extra a month above the minimum payment, like, let me go in. I don't even need to do this with you, but I'm happy to do it with anybody. I do no cost coaching. So like, hit me up, but like, but do this, go search in Google for a debt repayment calculator, pull up Nerd Wallets or whoever out there has a free one. Know that there's going to be advertiser disclaimers because they're going to throw ads at you, but like start plugging in some numbers, like $10,000 of credit card debt, 29% interest, let's say, to be on the higher end of things, and you're paying the minimum payment. So minimum payment's like typically around 2.5% or so. So let's say it's $250 a month. Plug that in. You're gonna pay like on that $10,000 of debt in this exact scenario, you're gonna pay like $20,000 or $25,000 on interest in the process of paying off that. But then bump it up by $100, $350 instead of the minimum payment. And it changes it to like, you're going to pay like $7,000 of interest. And I'm just, these aren't exact, but they're probably pretty close numbers. And because I'm just doing it off the top of my head. But then take it up by another $100 a month, right? And it's going to go down by less, but it's going to be $4,000 or so, $4,500 maybe of interest instead of, the original. And so that changes the game because that's $200 a month that you figured out from somewhere. Maybe it's just by tightening up on kind of whatever, going to get Chipotle when you're slow on time or whatever it is. Like that's a common one. Eating out a lot can be like, tighten that up by $200 a month, changes your life in terms of redirecting that towards debt repayment. And then when you redirect that, and part of the reason that it's so important to have debt repayment be not the classic cycle that people get into, which is they want to pay it all off at once.
Sure.
Right? So they get a bonus and they throw all of it at the debt repayment. But then by not having it be a consistent monthly payment that helps you pay it off over time slowly by knowing the date that you will pay it off, then what happens is your car breaks down or whatever happens and you go back in, or maybe just your normal monthly is your expenses are higher than your income. And so that bonus comes in, you pay off a little bit, but then it starts going back up over time. If you can make those types of small changes with debt repayment, then once you're done with that debt repayment, that $450 a month that was going towards that $10,000 of credit card debt, that's free cash flow again in your, and then you redirect that towards investments, redirect that towards savings. And the last piece that I'll say of why you make the debt repayment a consistent monthly payment is because you don't want it to be stretching to the point that you're not also contributing to a long-term emergency reserve.
100%.
If you can have some of it going towards that long-term emergency reserve, again, like, this is the only sales pitch you'll get from me, but like, come open a free account at your local credit union because they'll have a high yield on the savings account, right? So you'll be putting that money into the savings account and it'll be earning something at least.
And what's the name of that credit union again?
If you want to come to mine, it's Untapped Credit Union.
There you go.
We were formerly Coors Credit Union. That's where the name comes from. So yeah, but honestly, the credit unions we're a cooperative, right?
Nice.
And so like I have great friends at other credit unions. I think we're doing things that are exceptional personally.
Love it.
So like, yeah, come open a free account with us, but also like, Go check out your local credit union anyway, right? People aren't all in Colorado or in our town. And so you're then contributing to that long-term savings. You're earning some type of a yield on it. And when that problem comes up, you're paying off the debt also concurrently. And then when something comes up, you have a reserve to draw from to cover the auto expense that came up or to cover, whatever, or a medical bill or whatever else happened. And it doesn't cause you, that reserve can be the difference between going back into high interest credit card debt or having to take out a high interest personal loan and being able to weather the inevitable storm that's going to come up in our lives. So I can't stress enough that having that reserve, whether it's you've decided that my goal is 3 months of emergency reserve or 6 months, or maybe you're an entrepreneur and you're like, I want 12 months because I'm about to start my business for real, right? And last thing I'll say about the reserve is just that, like, this is an area where in order to figure out what 3 months of emergency reserve is, you need to know your living expenses and to put them into a tool like the cash flow spreadsheet or the WalletGyde app when it is fully productized and available
Q2,
and launched.
it's coming, trust me.
So like that type of stuff, that's what allows you to see the playing field and be like, whoa, like, I don't want to throw all of this towards the debt repayment. I want to have that emergency reserve. And right now I'm at 3 months and my goal is to make it to 6 months. If I contribute $100 a month towards the long-term emergency reserve while still doing an extra $100 a month on the minimum payment, then, right, you're able to like start seeing, and then you automate it. You automate the credit card payment, you automate the savings contribution. When you're ready, you get to the point where you automate those investment contributions, just like a 401k comes out of your paycheck before you ever see it. It just happens. Absolutely. And then last piece is that guilt-free spending number. Go ahead and automate that into a separate cash flow account, checking account, right? I like to call them cash flow accounts because we don't really use checks that much anymore. But have 2 checking accounts. And it's important to keep our finances simple, but the reason that you have 2 checking accounts is because then you automate the guilt-free spending towards that guilt-free account. You only, if you're a credit card points chaser, all sorts of psychology that I could go into there that I won't right now, but you can still use a credit card on that account. Just make it be your, chosen like 2% general card or whatever it is, that's the only one that you draw from for that checking account. Because then when that, let's say you have $800 a month of guilt-free spending, when that goes into that separate account, like you've already automated your investments, you've automated your savings, you've automated your credit card debt repayment, whatever. And then like that is over there and you're like, okay, cool. Throughout the month, I can watch it going down. I kind of know where I'm at. And you don't have to like, you don't have to be tracking every expense and spending a lot of time like separating out the variables and things like that. It's just happening, and that's how you get the flow of things, and you also got the long-term emergency reserve going, right? So it's like put all of those pieces together and you start to get like a pretty darn good system that hopefully minimizes the amount of time you need, but you're gonna get results from it, right?
Well, look, so I did tell you guys that Marshall is not just a run-of-the-mill kind of guy. Didn't I mean, come on. I mean, look at that sophisticated breakdown. Oh my goodness. So crazy enough, we've already been talking to close to 2 hours.
It's just too good.
So I mean, I actually even think we're due for part 2 because there's even more. I couldn't even. I was like, okay, we're gonna just do a part 2. There's much more in the document for us to cover. But I mean, look, we've already talked about some really cool stuff. Man, this is actually has to go down as I've had one of the most fun times, because we're just so excited. We're talking about money, right? And we go really deep, and it's for us. It's we understand the tactical as well as the emotional, which Jordan talks a lot about.
Mm-hmm.
Shout out to her. Also, shout out to Holly as well. Holly Murphy, she's really big on learning about and understanding your impact factor, which is really the difference between what you make and what you spend. So that cash flow. So, and then I loved how we talked about the different principles, the key principles, the 50-30-20, the pay yourself first. We're going to maybe perhaps in the part 2 talk about the snowball methods and things like that. And any parting last words, Marshall, you want to kind of leave to the audience?
Man, I think the parting words are simply, number one, that I'm really excited for part 2 already. And then the other one is just when it comes to our personal finances, I think it's really easy to want to offload it to somebody else or somebody out there, a financial advisor or something. But like, it does ultimately pay to become the hero in your own journey and to gain some measure of competency with the numbers, because that will lead you to the confidence to have the conversations that allow us to ultimately decide how we want to use this tool that can be so contentious in a way that resonates with us to design the lives that we want to live.
So beautiful. I mean, there's even a catch, if you want to call it a catchphrase or a phrase that we like to say in WalletGyde too. It's called customizing your life.
Customize your life.
Right. And that kind of resonated when you said that. So I think that's a great way for us to end for now. And guys, we're obviously having a part 2. So stay tuned on that one, guys. All right. See you guys.